6. Hidden reasons why you should stop telling people about your life. Vertical bar, Carl Jung. The more you talk about your life, the less you live it. Every time you tell someone what's happening in your soul, you give away a piece of your power. Carl Jung said that the deepest transformations happen in silence, not when you speak, but when you stop explaining. So stop telling people your plans, your pain, your progress. Because not everyone deserves access to your becoming. Part 1. The hidden psychological urge to overshare. There's something quietly tragic about the modern person's compulsion to tell everyone what's happening in their life. It's not always vanity. Often it's an invisible ache for validation, a hunger of the ego to feel real, to be seen and to be remembered. In Jungian psychology, this urge is not a trivial social quirk, but a symptom of a deeper psychic imbalance. It reflects a split between the ego and the self, a wound born from the fear of invisibility. The unconscious cries out for recognition, and in the absence of inner wholeness, the ego rushes to broadcast every fragment of its existence, hoping someone will mirror it back and say, "Yes, you exist." Oversharing in Jung's terms is not about information. It's about energy. Every time you tell someone what's happening in your life, you are not simply describing an event, you are transferring psychic energy outward. Jung believed that the psyche is a living energy system, and whatever we speak, confess, or expose changes the balance between our conscious and unconscious realms. When we reveal too much, we discharge energy that should have been used for inner transformation. What was meant to become wisdom, intuition, or spiritual power leaks out as gossip, noise, or compulsive confession. From a depth psychology perspective, oversharing is rarely conscious. It often begins with the childhood experience of not being fully seen or heard. The child who had to speak louder to get attention grows into the adult who must constantly narrate their life to feel significant. Jung called this complex activation a psychological pattern that repeats until it becomes a defense mechanism. The storytelling complex is one of the most subtle defenses of the modern ego. When a person cannot bear the silence within, they fill it with speech, hoping to drown out the insecurity that echoes beneath. This urge is magnified in a culture that rewards exposure. Social media platforms have turned self-disclosure into a ritual of belonging. But beneath every caption that says, "This is what I'm doing," there's an unspoken plea, "Please tell me I'm enough." Jung would call this a collective neurosis, an externalization of the inner need to be validated by the tribe. The modern ego has become a performance, an ongoing audition for attention, and yet the more one shares, the less one feels seen, because what others respond to is not the soul but the mask, the persona. The persona, in Jung's theory, is the social face we wear to adapt to the world. It's not evil, it's necessary. But when we identify with it too deeply, we forget that it's only a mask. Oversharing is the ego's way of maintaining that mask, of constantly repainting it to ensure it remains admired. It's a way of saying, "Don't forget who I am," but it's built on a paradox. The more the persona is reinforced, the weaker the real self becomes. You begin to live in fragments, little stories told to others to maintain an illusion of coherence. This fragmentation has spiritual consequences. When we tell everyone about what we're doing, feeling, or planning, we unconsciously divide ourselves from the silent part of our psyche, the inner witness. The act of explaining our life to others interrupts the ongoing dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious. Jung described individuation as a process of listening inwardly, of allowing images, symbols, and emotions to emerge from the depths. But how can one listen if one is constantly speaking? Speech becomes a shield against self-confrontation. We talk not to connect, but to avoid the anxiety of stillness. In analytical terms, this behavior mirrors what Jung called participation mystique, the primitive tendency to lose oneself in the collective psyche. In ancient times, it meant merging with the tribe or ritual. Today, it's the merging with the collective consciousness of digital life. The individual no longer holds private experiences as sacred. Everything must be shared, posted, or explained. This psychic fusion kills individuation. The sacred is lost because nothing is hidden anymore. What once was an inner revelation becomes mere content for validation. Oversharing also reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of psychological growth. People often equate expression with healing. If I talk about it, I'll feel better. And yes, confession can be therapeutic, but only when done in the right container. Jung understood that the psyche requires symbolic containment, just like alchemy requires a sealed vessel for transformation. If you open the vessel too soon, the process is destroyed. The same happens when you share personal insights prematurely. The energy of transformation dissipates before it becomes mature wisdom. True healing needs silence. It needs time to ferment. Words too early can become poison. The unconscious is not fond of being exposed. Jung wrote that when inner material is brought to light without readiness, the psyche rebels, it closes its gates. Oversharing is an act of psychic violence against oneself. It forces the unconscious to reveal what should have remained private until integrated. The result is psychological fatigue, emotional vulnerability, and spiritual disconnection. You feel drained after telling your story, not because you're weak, but because you've spent spiritual currency that wasn't ready to be spent. This is why truly self-aware people speak less about what they're going through. It's not secrecy for its own sake, it's psychic intelligence. They understand that every emotional experience, every dream, every conflict is part of a sacred dialogue between the ego and the self. Speaking prematurely about it breaks the dialogue. Jung often noted that people fear their own unconscious more than anything else. To talk excessively about your inner life is to try to domesticate that fear, to make it social explainable safe. But in doing so, you rob yourself of the transformative encounter that only silence can bring. Oversharing is also an attempt to outsource meaning. When we tell others about our lives, we are in essence asking them to interpret it for us. We want them to tell us what it means. Do you think I did the right thing? Am I being too emotional? Does this make sense? We're seeking external interpretation for inner symbols. Jung would see this as a refusal of responsibility, the ego's attempt to hand over the process of individuation to the collective. But the self cannot be known through second-hand reflection. It demands solitude, contemplation, and honesty that no audience can provide. Another layer of this phenomenon lies in the psychology of mirroring. Jungian analysts understand that we discover ourselves through reflection, but when the mirror becomes public opinion, the reflection is distorted. Oversharing invites others to become mirrors that project their own complexes onto you. Suddenly, your story is no longer yours, it's filtered through their unconscious material. The more people you tell, the more psychic contamination you invite. What started as a pure experience becomes muddled with projections, judgments, and expectations. This is how people lose touch with their intuition. They drown it in the noise of external feedback. In archetypal language, the act of oversharing corresponds to the trickster energy. The trickster loves exposure and chaos. It thrives on breaking boundaries, crossing lines, and turning the sacred into entertainment. When you share every thought and event, you're unconsciously possessed by this archetype. You may think you're being authentic, but authenticity without containment is self-sabotage. The trickster mocks the sacred by making it common. Jung warned that archetypes, when not consciously integrated, can take over the psyche and lead to emotional instability. The compulsive sharer is often under the spell of the trickster, driven by impulse, craving reaction, fearing silence. There's also a paradoxical anxiety behind oversharing, the fear that if we don't tell our story, it will disappear, as if unspoken experiences lose their reality. This anxiety comes from an underdeveloped ego structure that cannot yet trust its own perception. The ego seeks witnesses because it doubts its own experience. Jung might say the person has not yet developed an inner authority, a self strong enough to affirm, "This happened, I felt it, and that's enough." Instead, they seek confirmation. If others hear it, it becomes real. But true psychic maturity begins when you no longer need an audience to validate your reality. We might call this inner need a modern symptom of spiritual loneliness. The more disconnected a person is from their inner self, the more they try to connect outwardly. But the connections they create through oversharing are superficial. They do not heal the existential isolation of the soul. Jung believed that loneliness is not cured by company, but by communion with one's inner world. Speaking too much about your life keeps you on the surface, forever distracted from the deeper conversation waiting within you. In many cases, oversharing also masks an unconscious desire to control how others see you. By narrating your story, you control the narrative. You preempt their interpretations, you frame your image, you manage your myth. Jung observed that the ego fears being misunderstood because it equates misunderstanding with annihilation. To be seen inaccurately feels like psychic death. So we overshare to set the record straight, to make sure others see the real us. But ironically, the more we try to control perception, the more we become prisoners of it. The authentic self disappears under layers of performance. This self-disclosure addiction can also stem from what Jung called inferiority, of feeling a state where emotional intelligence is underdeveloped. The person cannot hold feelings internally, so they must express them externally to relieve pressure. Like steam escaping a kettle, talking becomes the only way to manage psychic tension. But if the person learned to contain the emotion through reflection, journaling, or silence, that tension could become energy for creativity or insight. Containment, not release, is the key to transformation. The alchemist does not spill his potion, he seals it until it becomes gold. From this view, silence is not repression, it's incubation. The modern misunderstanding of psychology has made people fear silence as if it were emotional avoidance. But Jung's approach was subtler. Silence is not denial, it's an act of reverence toward the unconscious. To hold something within you and allow it to speak in its own time is the highest form of respect for your inner world. When you stop telling everyone what's happening, you give your psyche permission to reveal its meaning, slowly, symbolically, through dreams, synchronicities, and subtle insights. Oversharing prevents the psyche from maturing. Every premature revelation is like opening a flower bud too early, it kills the bloom. The soul speaks in mystery, not announcements. When we rush to explain our experiences, we strip them of their symbolic power. Jung would call this reductionism, the ego's attempt to reduce mystery to rational explanation. The sacred must remain partially hidden to stay alive. That's why in every spiritual tradition there's a vow of silence, a respect for the unsaid. Jung recognized that the soul operates through secrecy, not deception, but depth. The compulsion to tell everyone what's happening in your life is at its root a fear of being alone with your own story. It's easier to narrate than to feel. Jung said that the greatest burden a soul must carry is its own individuality. Most people will do anything to avoid that confrontation. Oversharing becomes the modern defense against individuality. It diffuses your uniqueness into the collective. You become part of the noise instead of the voice. You lose the intimacy of inner dialogue and trade it for the applause of strangers. Psychologically, the remedy is not to become a hermit, but to develop discriminating awareness, to ask yourself before speaking, why am I telling this? What am I hoping to receive in return? Is this coming from myself or my ego? Jung believed that every act of self-expression carries an intention, conscious or unconscious. When you can identify that intention, you reclaim the energy that was about to be spent unconsciously. That energy can then be redirected inward toward creative or spiritual work. You stop leaking energy through speech and begin to store it as strength. To stop telling everyone what's happening in your life is not a social command, it's a psychological initiation. It marks the moment when you realize that your story is sacred, not because it's dramatic, but because it belongs first to you. The self demands privacy. It reveals itself only in silence, only in solitude, only when you stop explaining and start listening. The ego speaks to be heard. The self whispers to be known. The less you say, the more you feel. The quieter you become, the louder your soul begins to speak. Part 2. Ego validation and the fear of invisibility. The need to be seen is one of the most powerful and dangerous instincts in the human psyche. Beneath the surface of our social behaviors, every status update, every personal confession, every carefully worded story about our day, there lies a desperate craving for acknowledgement. Jung understood this as the hunger of the ego to affirm its own existence. It is not enough for the ego to simply be, it must be seen being. Without witness, it begins to doubt itself. Invisibility feels like annihilation. This fear of invisibility is not a small neurosis. It's a fundamental existential anxiety. To be unseen by others mirrors the deeper terror of being unseen by oneself. When no one mirrors your existence, you start to wonder whether you exist at all. Jung observed that much of human behavior is driven by the unconscious attempt to escape this metaphysical loneliness. The ego clings to recognition the way a drowning person clings to air. It needs constant reflection, like Narcissus staring into the pool, mistaking his own reflection for love. But what the ego calls validation is often just a defense against inner emptiness. The more fragile the sense of self, the greater the need for others to confirm it. This is why some people cannot go a single day without explaining, posting, or proving something about themselves. They are running from the silence where the truth of their emptiness waits. Jung would say they have become possessed by their persona, the social mask they created to interact with the world. When the mask becomes the identity, the person must perform endlessly to keep it alive. The persona, though necessary, is a double-edged sword. It allows us to function in society, to play roles, to communicate. But it is not the self. It's a symbolic garment, not the body beneath. The danger arises when the ego forgets this distinction. The modern individual has so over-identified with the persona that they believe their entire worth lies in how they are perceived. Life becomes a mirror, not an experience. You begin to exist only through the eyes of others. And when those eyes turn away, the ego panics. It collapses into a crisis of meaning. This panic is the root of what Jung called the neurosis of modernity, the fragmentation of the inner world caused by the worship of outer validation. People no longer live from within. They perform themselves into exhaustion. Every action becomes a strategy to maintain recognition. You see it in the anxiety that arises when a post receives no attention, when a message goes unanswered, or when someone's success outshines your own. These are not mere social frustrations. They are psychic wounds, reflections of an ego that cannot survive without external mirrors. To the Jungian mind, this dependence reveals a deep disconnection from the self, the center of the total psyche. The self does not need to be seen, it simply is. Its existence is absolute, not relational. But the ego, when cut off from the self, becomes a wandering orphan. It lives on borrowed light, feeding on attention to avoid collapsing into shadow. The more it depends on others to affirm its existence, the weaker its internal structure becomes. It's like a candle trying to stay lit in a storm. It needs constant shelter, constant affirmation, constant eyes watching. What makes this fear so insidious is its invisibility. Most people don't recognize that their need for attention is not social but spiritual. They confuse being known with being loved, being seen with being valued. But Jung understood that the desire to be seen by others is a distorted reflection of the soul's desire to be seen by the divine within, to be recognized by the self. When you don't have that internal recognition, you chase it externally. Every story you tell about yourself becomes a prayer to the wrong God, the God of the collective. The collective consciousness, what Jung called the great psychic field of society, feeds this illusion. It whispers that visibility equals value, that relevance equals worth. In such a world, silence becomes heresy. People who withhold their personal lives are called mysterious or distant, as if privacy were a sin. Yet, from a depth psychological view, privacy is not distance, it is integration. The person who no longer needs to be seen has already been seen by something greater, their own soul. The tragedy is that the more one seeks validation, the more one loses authenticity. When your actions are motivated by the need to be perceived, you begin to act, not to live. Your behavior becomes reactive, shaped by what will be approved, admired, or envied. Jung called this living according to the persona, and it's one of the greatest obstacles to individuation. The ego becomes a curator of impressions, not an instrument of experience. You start editing yourself for the imaginary audience that lives inside your head. This internal audience is what Jung described as the crowd within a psychological manifestation of collective values. It's the internalized gaze of society. Even when you are alone, it watches you. It judges your silence, your choices, your words. And because this inner crowd is unconscious, you cannot argue with it, you obey it automatically. This is why people feel compelled to narrate their every move. The ego fears the disapproval of the invisible crowd more than it desires inner peace. To go unseen by that crowd feels like death to the false self. From a symbolic standpoint, invisibility represents the descent into the unconscious, the place where one's true self resides. To embrace invisibility is to surrender to the darkness within, to explore the parts of the psyche that do not need to be witnessed to be real, but few are willing to make that descent. They would rather be half seen than truly known, half alive in the light of attention than fully alive in the shadow of solitude. Jung said that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The same applies to the psyche. Without the courage to descend into invisibility, the ego remains shallow forever, seeking sunlight it cannot bear. Ego validation is the substitute for spiritual grounding. It's easier to collect compliments than to confront emptiness. But validation is like a drug. It soothes temporarily but deepens dependency. Every like, every nod, every compliment reinforces the illusion that your worth depends on external confirmation. The psyche becomes conditioned like Pavlov's dog salivating for the next signal of approval. Jung would call this a possession by the collective archetype, a psychic enslavement, where the ego no longer belongs to itself. This enslavement has consequences. When you base your sense of identity on being seen, you give others the power to unmake you. Criticism becomes a threat to existence. Rejection becomes an identity crisis. The person who thrives on validation cannot tolerate misunderstanding because they have no inner anchor. Jung often warned that whatever you repress controls you. Here, what's repressed is not a memory but the awareness of your own divine autonomy. The more you deny your inner self, the more you become addicted to external mirrors. In the language of depth psychology, this cycle can be described as ego inflation, followed by ego deflation. Validation inflates the ego. It feels godlike for a moment, invincible, radiant. But because this energy doesn't come from the self, it quickly collapses. The high fades, leaving emptiness and shame. To escape the fall, the ego seeks new validation, creating a psychological pendulum, exaltation and despair, applause and silence, existence and invisibility. Jung saw this as a form of psychic vampirism, the ego feeding on attention because it cannot draw energy from within. This explains why some of the most outwardly confident people feel chronically hollow. Their confidence is built on mirrors, not roots. The true self does not need to be broadcast. It radiates quietly from within. You can feel it in people who no longer care to explain themselves. They have reached what Jung called inner authority, the realization that one's value is self-sustaining. They do not withdraw out of arrogance, but out of integrity. Their silence is not an absence, but a fullness too sacred to display. The fear of invisibility, then, is not about being unseen by others. It's about being unseen by oneself. The ego uses visibility as a distraction from the inner gaze. To truly see oneself is to encounter the shadow, the parts we repress, deny, or hide. Most people would rather live in the light of external attention than face the darkness of their own contradictions. Yet Jung insisted that real transformation happens only when the individual withdraws their projections from the outer world and turns them inward. To stop needing to be seen is to reclaim projection. It's to take back the energy we've scattered across other people's eyes. There's a paradox here. The moment you stop needing validation, you begin to emanate genuine presence. People who no longer crave attention become magnetic, not because they seek eyes, but because they've found light. This is the paradox of individuation. By embracing invisibility, you become truly visible not to the collective, but to consciousness itself. Jung might say that such people live from the self, not the ego. Their presence speaks louder than their stories. From a therapeutic perspective, healing this pattern requires developing what Jung called ego-self alignment. The ego must learn to serve the self rather than substitute for it. This begins with radical self-observation, seeing your own hunger for validation without judgment. When you notice the impulse to tell, prove, or explain, pause. Ask, who am I trying to convince? Usually it's not others. It's the fragile ego itself. By seeing this, you begin to dissolve the compulsion. You reclaim psychic energy that had been wasted on maintaining appearances. Jung often used the image of the mask and the face to describe this dynamic. The mask persona must fit the face, self, but never replace it. A healthy ego uses the mask consciously. It knows when to wear it and when to remove it. But when the mask fuses with the face, the person forgets who they are beneath. Oversharing is the moment when the mask begins to talk for you. It speaks not to communicate, but to survive. The cure is not silence for its own sake, but silence born of self-trust. When you trust your own reality, you no longer need others to mirror it. To illustrate, consider how children seek validation. They constantly ask, look at me, look what I did. This is developmentally healthy. It builds a sense of self through feedback. But if that feedback becomes the only source of identity, the child never grows into inner validation. They remain psychic children in adult bodies, forever performing for applause. Jung called this the puer eternus, the eternal child archetype, one who refuses psychological adulthood. To mature spiritually is to stop saying, look at me, and start saying, I see me. At its core, the ego's fear of invisibility is the fear of non-existence. But non-existence in Jung's language is not death, it's the gateway to the self. The ego must be willing to dissolve in order to be renewed. This dissolution happens through silence, solitude, and humility, the very states the modern person avoids. The moment you stop needing to tell others what's happening in your life, you experience a symbolic death of the old self, the part that depended on reflection to survive. It feels terrifying at first, like falling into a void, but the void is not empty. It is full of unseen life. It's the womb of your own consciousness waiting for you to return. The ego's obsession with validation also distorts relationships. When you depend on others to see you, you stop seeing them. Every interaction becomes a mirror check. You listen only to hear yourself reflected back. Jung would describe this as projection through identification. You use others as surfaces for your own insecurities. Real intimacy becomes impossible because you're not relating to the person in front of you, you're relating to the image of yourself that you hope they see. This is why so many relationships fail, not because of conflict, but because of unconscious performance. Two masks fall in love, two true selves remain untouched. To break this cycle, one must risk being unseen. The paradox of individuation is that it requires solitude not as punishment but as purification. Jung said that a person who cannot stand being alone has not yet met themselves. When you sit in invisibility long enough, you begin to feel something ancient rising, a quiet knowing that you are enough without witnesses. This is not arrogance, it's wholeness. The self does not perform, it simply radiates. It does not explain, it embodies. The fear of invisibility fades when you realize that the eyes that truly matter are not external, they are the eyes of awareness. When you are awake to yourself, you are never unseen. The collective may forget your name, but your soul remembers. Validation becomes unnecessary because existence itself becomes validation. Jung might say, this is the moment when the ego surrenders its false kingship and bows to the self, the inner monarch that rules without needing to be admired. In the end, the ego's desperate need to be seen is a misunderstanding of its role. The ego was never meant to be worshipped. It was meant to serve. It's the bridge, not the destination. When it stops demanding validation and starts listening to the self, it becomes a true instrument of consciousness. The person no longer needs to shout their story across the world because they've become the story, the silent embodiment of it. Visibility loses its seduction. Invisibility becomes freedom. The unseen life, Jung would say, is not lesser, it's deeper. The ego wants the spotlight. The soul wants the depth. When you choose depth, you disappear from the noise but appear in truth. And that ultimately is what the ego has always been searching for, not to be seen by others but to be finally seen by itself. Part 3. The shadow and the energy of secrecy. The parts of ourselves that we do not show to the world do not disappear. They grow stronger in silence. Jung called this hidden dimension of the psyche, the shadow, the collection of qualities, instincts, and emotions that we repress, deny, or project onto others. Most people believe that their secrets weaken them, that silence is a form of hiding. But in Jungian psychology, secrecy when conscious is not a weakness, it is power. The energy you do not leak through words becomes potential for transformation. Silence then becomes a vessel for alchemical change. When people constantly talk about their lives, they scatter their psychic energy across the world. They give pieces of their inner world to strangers, acquaintances, and fleeting moments. They reveal not just facts but emotions, dreams, and desires that have not yet matured into insight. Jung would say that this is how a person loses their libido, not merely sexual energy, but the total psychic force that animates the soul. What could have been channeled into creativity, intuition, or spiritual strength dissipates in the noise of disclosure. The shadow starves when you overexpose yourself. It loses the pressure it needs to transform. The shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply unintegrated energy. Every time you resist silence and overshare, you keep the shadow unconscious. Why? Because speaking about your darkness too quickly makes you think you've mastered it. You label it, analyze it, explain it, and in doing so, you kill its transformative power. Jung warned that the shadow must be lived, not explained. It must be faced directly in experience, not talked away. This is why secrecy has such psychological potency. It keeps the shadow alive within you long enough to mature into awareness. Secrecy in the Jungian sense is not deception, it's containment. It's the recognition that not everything that happens inside you should be exposed to the daylight of other minds. Just as the alchemist seals the vessel to protect the process, you must guard your inner transformation from premature exposure. When you talk too soon about your struggles, your growth, or your pain, you open the vessel before the transformation is complete. The raw material of your psyche spills out unrefined. You might feel momentary relief, but you lose depth. The shadow once disturbed retreats further underground. There is a difference between repression and sacred secrecy. Repression hides the shadow out of fear. Secrecy protects it out of respect. Repression denies what is within. Secrecy acknowledges it but keeps it private until it becomes meaningful. Jung observed that the psyche, like nature, has its own timing. You cannot force it to reveal its wisdom. When you hold something inside long enough, your anger, jealousy, sadness, or ambition, it begins to reveal its symbolic meaning. But if you speak about it too soon, you stop the alchemical process. You stay at the level of literal emotion, never reaching the symbolic truth. People often misunderstand this. They think they are healing when they confess everything. But confession without integration is merely exposure. Jung once noted that the act of verbal confession in therapy only has value when it leads to understanding. Talking for the sake of release is catharsis, not transformation. It's emotional drainage without meaning. Secrecy, on the other hand, invites meaning to form. It allows the psyche to metabolize the experience before it's translated into words. In this sense, secrecy is not hiding, it's gestation. The shadow thrives in darkness because that's where truth begins. In dreams, fantasies, and silent reflections, the shadow shows its face. When you constantly speak about your life, you drown out its voice. The shadow communicates not through speech, but through symbols, images, moods, and synchronicities. Silence allows those signals to rise, but most people fear silence because they mistake it for emptiness. They do not realize that the silence of the outer world is the speech of the inner one. Every time you resist the urge to tell someone your latest feeling or revelation, you are building psychic muscle. You are learning to hold energy instead of leaking it. Holding energy is one of the most crucial aspects of Jungian individuation. The alchemical metaphor for this is the nigredo, the black stage of transformation, where the soul sits in its own darkness. It is uncomfortable, even painful, but necessary. The shadow reveals itself here, not in conversation, not in sharing, but in solitude. To sit in your darkness without rushing to explain it is an act of courage. Jung believed that most people never individuate because they refuse to endure this stage. They would rather talk than feel. They would rather confess than confront. But the psyche does not reward avoidance. It waits in silence, and only those who can bear that silence gain its wisdom. Silence becomes a kind of magnet for the unconscious. When you stop speaking about your inner life, you invite the unconscious to fill the void with its language, symbols, images, and intuition. You begin to dream more vividly, sense more deeply, and think more clearly. What used to be unconscious becomes accessible not through explanation but through presence. The shadow once feared becomes an ally. It whispers insights that no one else can give you, because it speaks in the private dialect of your own soul. In this way, secrecy is a form of intimacy with yourself. To keep certain thoughts or experiences unspoken is to say, "This belongs to me." It's an act of psychic sovereignty. You stop giving your power to others by asking them to interpret or validate your inner world. You become your own interpreter. Jung said that every person has an inner guide, an inner self that speaks through intuition. But you can only hear it in silence. Every word you speak to explain yourself to others drowns out that voice. Sacred secrecy, therefore, is not isolation. It's devotion to that inner dialogue. The energy of secrecy also plays a role in magnetism. People who speak little about their inner lives often exude a quiet power. Jung might say this is because their libido has not been dissipated through excessive speech. They carry the weight of unspoken meaning. You can feel it in their presence, in the way their words, when finally spoken, have gravity. They embody what the alchemists called occultum lapidem, the hidden stone, the essence of transformation that gains value precisely because it is hidden. In modern terms, their mystery is not a tactic. It's the natural aura of someone who has retained their psychic energy. To contrast this, look at people who constantly expose their inner world. They appear transparent but feel hollow. Their words lose power because they are unsealed, unguarded, and repetitive. They reveal everything but understand nothing. Jung would interpret this as a defense mechanism. Their compulsive openness protects them from introspection. By sharing everything they avoid, facing what remains unresolved inside. They confuse vulnerability with exposure, thinking that if they show everything, they will finally feel whole. But wholeness does not come from exposure, it comes from integration. The shadow needs your privacy the way a seed needs soil. Too much light and it cannot germinate. Silence is the soil of the psyche. When you cultivate secrecy, you create the conditions for growth. The alchemists knew that transformation requires containment. They called it the hermetic seal. The same law applies to psychology. If you open your inner processes to the opinions and energies of others too soon, the transformation evaporates. The unconscious feeling violated withdraws. You lose access to your inner laboratory. This explains why some of the deepest spiritual experiences are wordless. Mystics, poets, and visionaries often refuse to describe what they've seen, not because they lack language, but because they respect the mystery. They understand that naming something too early kills its essence. Jung admired this restraint. He saw in it the wisdom of the unconscious, the understanding that the sacred cannot be commodified through speech. In your own life, every time you keep a secret, not out of fear but reverence, you are practicing the same sacred restraint. There is also a moral dimension to secrecy. Jung believed that the shadow contains not only our darkness, but also our unrealized goodness, qualities we've repressed because they didn't fit our persona. The person who always shares, who always explains, may seem open but is often disconnected from their moral center. Their speech becomes mechanical, habitual, devoid of moral reflection. The person who practices conscious secrecy, however, begins to discern the difference between expression and exploitation. They learn to ask, is this truth ready to be shared? Does this word serve the soul, or does it serve my insecurity? This discernment is the beginning of wisdom. In relationships, the energy of secrecy creates respect. When you hold certain experiences privately, you signal that your inner world is sacred, not public property. You stop being easily readable, easily manipulated. Jung said that people who lack boundaries invite psychic invasion. When you share everything, you give others access to your psyche. They enter through empathy, curiosity, or even envy. But when you keep certain things within, you maintain psychological autonomy. You become a mystery that others cannot fully grasp, and this mystery protects you. It's not arrogance, it's self-possession. In a culture obsessed with openness, secrecy has become an act of rebellion. But in Jungian psychology, it's not rebellion against others, it's rebellion against unconsciousness. The unconscious world is vast and ancient. It communicates in symbols, not posts or confessions. When you tell everyone what's happening in your life, you flatten that depth into narrative. You reduce mystery into explanation. Jung would call this a desecration of the psyche. You treat the sacred like gossip. Sacred secrecy reverses this process. It restores the dimension of awe. You begin to live your life as a mystery unfolding, not a story to be told. The energy you save through secrecy doesn't just sit idle. It condenses into intuition. Jung described intuition as the direct perception of possibilities, the ability to sense patterns before they manifest. This capacity grows stronger in people who can hold experiences silently. When you talk too soon, you drain that energy into the external world. But when you stay silent, that same energy crystallizes into insight. Suddenly you begin to understand things without analysis. You sense connections, meanings, and warnings. You become psychically alive, not just socially reactive. The shadow, when approached with respect, becomes a guide. But it demands silence as the price of entry. It will not reveal itself to those who gossip about their souls. It comes to those who can sit in darkness without asking for witnesses. This is the paradox of inner work. The less you speak about it, the more real it becomes. Jung wrote that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Silence is that defeat, the ego's surrender to something greater. Every time you resist the impulse to explain yourself, you are bowing to the self. You are admitting that there are forces within you that words cannot tame. Sacred secrecy also protects love, creativity, and spirituality, the three areas most corrupted by overexposure. When you share too much about love, you dilute its mystery. It becomes a performance instead of communion. When you talk too much about creative projects, you disperse the energy that should be shaping the work. And when you expose your spiritual experiences prematurely, you lose their sacred charge. They become intellectual ideas instead of lived transformation. The unconscious punishes such exposure by withdrawing its gifts. You feel empty, uninspired, disconnected. But if you hold your secrets with patience, they mature into art, wisdom, or peace. In alchemical language, secrecy is associated with soul nidja, the black sun, the invisible light of transformation. It represents the moment when the soul glows in darkness, unseen by the world. Jung saw this symbol as the image of individuation itself, illumination that comes from within, not from external validation. To carry that black sun within you, you must stop leaking your light through unnecessary speech. You must become the guardian of your own fire. Every sacred tradition recognizes this law in some form. The yogi keeps his mantra secret. The magician conceals his rituals. The mystic retreats into silence. Even in psychology, the analyst maintains confidentiality not merely out of ethics, but to preserve the sanctity of the unconscious process. Words once released into the social sphere lose their alchemical potency. They become noise. Silence, in contrast, concentrates power. It turns experience into essence. You can feel the difference in your own life. When you share a deep realization too soon, it fades. When you keep it private, it grows stronger, shaping your perception from within. Jung understood this as the conservation of psychic energy, a principle as real as the conservation of physical energy. Energy not expressed outwardly transforms inwardly. This transformation is what creates character, depth, and resilience. The people who carry mystery are not withholding, they are ripening. The shadow and secrecy, then, are not enemies but partners. The shadow gives you the raw material, the instinctual drives, fears, and hidden desires, and secrecy provides the container for their refinement. Together, they create individuality. Without secrecy, the shadow remains raw chaos. Without the shadow, secrecy becomes repression. But when both are balanced, you experience the birth of genuine depth. You become whole not because you have exposed everything, but because you have learned to hold it with consciousness. The energy of secrecy is the energy of transformation. It's what turns pain into meaning, fear into courage, and solitude into power. The modern world tells you to speak your truth, but Jung would remind you that truth to have power must first be silent. What is sacred cannot survive in the marketplace of opinions. It can only live in the protected chamber of your soul, the place where words end and meaning begins. Part 4. Why silence creates power. Silence is not the absence of words, it is the presence of energy. In Jungian psychology, silence is a psychic field where consciousness reorganizes itself. When you stop speaking, explaining, and justifying, something begins to stir beneath the surface, something ancient, autonomous, and alive. That stillness is not emptiness, it's potential. The unconscious moves most freely when the mouth is closed. Every word is a direction of energy. Every silence is its gathering. Jung saw silence as a necessary part of psychological transformation. The psyche is a living organism that needs containment to evolve. When you speak too much, you release energy that should have been used for integration. You externalize what was meant to internalize. But when you are silent, energy stays inside the psychic system. It circulates, refines, condenses. This is why those who know how to keep silent often appear powerful without trying. They carry density. Their silence is not lack but gravity. Power in the Jungian sense is not domination, it's integration. True power emerges when your thoughts, instincts, and emotions are aligned under the direction of the self. Most people are too dispersed to be powerful. Their energy leaks through constant speech, explanation, and justification. They give their inner life away in fragments, small talk, gossip, endless narratives. Jung would say that their libido has been extravagantly projected into the world. What could have become insight becomes chatter. What could have become transformation becomes repetition. To be silent is to reclaim your projections. It's to draw back the energy you've scattered across the world and concentrate it inside yourself. This is what gives silence its intensity. People who live in silence for long periods often report that their perception changes. They see more, hear more, feel more. The senses sharpen because the mind is no longer diffused through speech. Jung described this as introversion of libido, the turning of psychic energy inward toward the self. It's not withdrawal, it's recollection. And recollection in its original meaning means to gather what was scattered. In a world obsessed with expression, silence becomes subversive. We are told that to be silent is to be weak, to lack opinion, to be passive. But in the language of depth, psychology, silence is the most active form of psychic work. It's the alchemical vessel where the opposites of the psyche, light and shadow, ego and self-conscious and unconscious, meet and transform. Words are too crude for this process. Only silence can hold the tension without breaking it. Jung called this holding the tension of the opposites, a principle at the heart of individuation. When you resist the urge to resolve inner conflict through speech, you allow a third thing to emerge, a transcendent insight that unites both sides. Silence also disciplines the ego. The ego wants to be heard, validated, and admired. It feeds on external recognition. To practice silence is to starve the ego of its usual nourishment. It begins to panic. It wants to justify itself, to explain its worth, to prove its existence. But if you can sit through that panic, if you can bear the hunger for attention without satisfying it, something remarkable happens. The ego softens. It begins to realize that it doesn't need to speak to exist. It discovers its own boundaries. This is how silence transforms egoic noise into conscious strength. The power of silence lies in its paradox. It disempowers the false self while empowering the true one. The false self thrives on reaction. It exists only in the exchange of energy between you and others. When you stop reacting, when you fall silent, you remove its fuel. You begin to see how much of your behavior was driven by external triggers. Silence reveals your dependencies. It exposes where you've been unconsciously manipulated by praise, criticism, or expectation. Jung described this process as withdrawing projections, seeing the psychic energy you've invested in others and reclaiming it. Every silence is a withdrawal. Every word restraint is an act of repossession. Silence is also an amplifier of intuition. Jung considered intuition one of the 4 fundamental psychological functions, alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation. But intuition operates below speech. It perceives patterns before thought can articulate them. In silence, intuition becomes the dominant mode. You start to feel the contours of unseen realities. The unconscious communicates in subtle impressions, and these can only be heard in stillness. This is why many of Jung's patients reported vivid dreams, synchronicities, and insights during periods of solitude and silence. The psyche begins to speak in its own language, when words no longer interfere. There's an archetypal dimension to this as well. Silence belongs to the hermit archetype, the seeker who retreats from the noise of the collective to commune with inner truth. Every culture has its version of this figure: the monk, the sage, the prophet, the wise woman in the woods. Jung saw such figures not as symbols of withdrawal, but as embodiments of wholeness. They represent the human capacity to find wisdom within, independent of social validation. The hermit's silence is not isolation, it's autonomy. It's the refusal to let the collective dictate the meaning of experience. In modern life, silence feels almost unnatural because the collective consciousness has become addicted to noise. Jung would say that the world's obsession with constant communication reflects a psychic imbalance, an overemphasis on the conscious, rational mind. Noise is the ego's attempt to drown out the unconscious. The moment things become quiet, the shadow stirs. Thoughts arise, emotions surface, memories return. Most people cannot endure this confrontation. They turn on music, scroll through feeds, start talking anything to avoid hearing the unconscious whisper. But that whisper contains everything the ego claims to seek: truth, meaning, and peace. The reason silence creates power is because it restores the natural hierarchy of the psyche. The ego stops dominating, and the self begins to guide. The voice of the self is not loud, it's subtle, intuitive, and symbolic. You can only hear it when everything else has quieted. Jung compared this process to descending into a well. You must go down into darkness to draw up clear water. Speech keeps you at the surface. Silence takes you to the depths. Psychologically, silence functions like a mirror. When you stop speaking, you start listening, not just to others, but to yourself. You begin to notice your internal dialogue, the constant chatter of the ego. Most of that chatter is defensive. It rehearses explanations, prepares excuses, repeats grievances. In silence, you start to see it for what it is: the ego's desperate attempt to stay relevant. When you stop participating in that dialogue, it loses power. You realize that you are not the voice inside your head. You are the awareness that listens to it. This shift from identification to observation is the foundation of individuation. Silence also sharpens perception of others. When you stop filling the space with your own words, you begin to sense what others are not saying. You perceive energy, tone, and subtext. You hear the unconscious behind their speech, the fear, insecurity, or projection. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates between people continuously beneath the level of conscious conversation. Most miss it because they are too busy talking. Silence makes you psychically receptive. You stop reacting to the surface and start reading the field. This is real power, not manipulation, but awareness. The ancient alchemists understood this intuitively. They called silence the royal art of listening to the fire. They knew that transformation happens in the still chamber, not the marketplace. Jung borrowed heavily from this symbolism. He saw the alchemical vessel as a metaphor for the psyche, a container where opposites are held until a new substance emerges. The vessel must remain sealed, silent for the reaction to occur. Open it too soon, and everything evaporates. The same law applies to psychological transformation. If you speak about an insight before it matures, it dissipates. Silence ensures that the inner fire refines instead of escapes. Silence is not passivity, it's concentration. To be silent is to become dense with presence. Think of a mountain, it doesn't speak yet, it dominates the horizon. Its power lies in its stillness. In the same way, when you cultivate inner silence, you become grounded. You stop chasing reactions, outcomes, and recognition. You stop scattering yourself. People can feel this density even if they can't name it. They sense that you are not leaking energy. Your silence becomes a boundary, an invisible field that protects your integrity. This is why manipulators and narcissists dislike silence. They rely on emotional reaction to control others. When you respond with silence, you deny them that energy. You become unpredictable, unreadable. Jung might describe this as the ego's emancipation from the collective shadow. You are no longer an actor in someone else's projection. You are an observer. Silence disarms control because it breaks the unconscious dance of reaction. In that moment, power shifts. You are no longer being influenced. You are influencing by not participating. At a deeper level, silence reveals the creative nature of the psyche. Jung believed that every human being carries within them a spark of the divine, a creative principle he called the self. This self is not a concept, it's a living intelligence. It knows how to heal, balance, and evolve the individual, but the self cannot be heard through constant talking or thinking. Its voice is felt in stillness, as intuition, as sudden clarity, as inner peace. When you fall silent, you make space for the self to express itself. The ego falls back. The inner artist, healer, or sage steps forward. This is why some of the most profound revelations come not during conversation, but in solitude, in the car, in nature, in the shower, in prayer. These are moments when the outer noise fades and the inner signal strengthens. Jung said that the unconscious compensates for the one-sidedness of consciousness. If your outer life is filled with noise, the unconscious will seek silence to balance it. If you provide it willingly, you collaborate with your psyche. If you resist it, the unconscious will force silence upon you through exhaustion, illness, or crisis. The psyche will do whatever it takes to restore equilibrium. Silence, therefore, is not optional for growth. It's inevitable. You can choose it consciously through self-discipline, or you can meet it through suffering. Jung's patients often experienced what he called the silence of despair, a period when life seemed meaningless, relationships fell apart, and words failed. These were not failures of life, but invitations to listen. The psyche withdraws energy from the outer world to redirect it inward. If the person resists, they fall into depression. If they cooperate, they enter individuation. Silence becomes the threshold between breakdown and breakthrough. From a symbolic perspective, silence corresponds to death and rebirth. Every initiation in mythology includes a period of withdrawal into silence, the cave, the desert, the tomb. Jung interpreted these as archetypal representations of psychic transformation. The old self must die so the new one can emerge. Silence is the space in which that death occurs. You stop speaking the language of the old identity. You stop defending your history. You become nothing for a while. And in that nothingness, the self begins to take shape. The silence that once felt empty becomes the cradle of new being. The relationship between silence and creativity is equally profound. Artists, writers, and visionaries know that inspiration comes not from constant production, but from intervals of silence. Jung saw creativity as a dialogue between the conscious and unconscious. The unconscious offers symbols, the conscious shapes them into form, but this dialogue requires quiet. Too much talking, thinking, or planning drowns out the voice of imagination. That's why the most creative people often guard their solitude. They know that ideas need silence the way fire needs oxygen. Even in communication, silence holds power. The pauses between words give speech its rhythm and meaning. In therapy, Jung often used silence as a tool. He would let the patient's words hang in the air until their deeper meaning surfaced. Silence forced them to confront their own thoughts instead of seeking reassurance. It's a mirror that shows truth without commentary. In everyday life, strategic silence can transform conflict. When you stop reacting, the other person must face their own noise. Your silence becomes a psychological mirror in which they see themselves. There's also a spiritual dimension to this. Jung was deeply interested in the mystical traditions that equated silence with divine presence. He noted that in both Eastern and Western mysticism, silence is not the absence of God, but the medium through which God speaks. Where words fail, he wrote, the spirit begins. When you enter true silence, you enter what mystics call the numinous, the direct experience of the sacred. It's overwhelming because it bypasses intellect. You don't think the divine, you feel it. And that feeling rearranges you. The ego cannot speak in the presence of the sacred, it can only bow. Psychologically, this moment corresponds to the experience of awe, the recognition that something larger than the ego is moving through you. Awe requires silence, because it suspends the mind's habitual chatter, it opens space for wonder. Jung saw this as essential for mental health. Without moments of awe, the psyche dries up. It becomes mechanical, cynical, and over-rational. Silence restores mystery. It reminds you that not everything can be explained, that meaning arises from participation, not control. The power of silence, then, is the power of alignment with the self, with nature, with reality itself. When you stop fighting to be heard, you start hearing life as it is. You stop imposing narratives and start perceiving patterns. You begin to sense the invisible threads that connect events, people, and symbols. This is what Jung meant by synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal the hidden order of the psyche. Silence attunes you to that order. You start noticing how everything communicates when you stop trying to control the conversation. To live in silence is not to withdraw from life, but to enter it more deeply. You become less reactive, more observant, more intentional. Words become sacred again because you use them sparingly. Speech becomes expression, not discharge. Each word carries energy because it emerges from stillness. This is what gives depth to a person's presence, the sense that behind their words lies an ocean of silence. Jung would call this the emergence of the self-possessed individual, someone whose energy is centralized, not dispersed. Silence also heals relationships in ways that words cannot. Many conflicts persist because both sides keep talking, defending, and explaining. Silence breaks the loop. It allows emotional truth to surface without interference. When you stop trying to convince or justify, you create a space for authenticity. Sometimes the most compassionate response is silence, not because you don't care, but because you respect the complexity of the moment. Jung often said that the deepest understanding is not intellectual, but symbolic. Silence is the symbol of understanding that transcends explanation. In the end, silence creates power because it brings you back to essence. It strips away the unnecessary, the performative, the borrowed. What remains is pure being. The ego resists this simplicity because it cannot measure or control it, but the soul thrives in it. In silence, you remember who you are, not the roles you play, not the stories you tell, but the consciousness that watches all of it unfold. You realize that the greatest influence you can have on the world is not through noise, but through presence. Silence, then, is not emptiness, it is fullness held in perfect stillness. Part 5. The manipulative power of disclosure. Every time you tell someone what's happening in your life, you hand them a piece of your psychic blueprint. Most people think sharing is connection, but from a Jungian lens, it is often exposure, a psychological transaction in which you surrender energy symbols and vulnerabilities to another person's unconscious. Jung would say that speech is never neutral. It's an energetic exchange. Words are psychic currency, and every time you disclose something deeply personal, you spend a portion of that currency. In the right hands, disclosure can create intimacy. In the wrong hands, it becomes manipulation. The unconscious does not distinguish between literal and symbolic energy. When you reveal something about yourself, your fears, desires, traumas, you open a psychic channel. The person listening doesn't just hear the words. Their unconscious begins to interact with yours. They may project their own complexes onto you, interpret your story through their wounds, or unconsciously try to control the narrative you've revealed. Jung saw this dynamic constantly in human relationships. We think we're having conversations, but what's really happening is a silent negotiation of power between egos and shadows. This is why disclosure can be dangerous. Once your inner material leaves your mouth, it no longer belongs to you. It becomes subject to the projections, judgments, and desires of others. Your story transforms into their perception, your vulnerability into their leverage. Jung wrote that the psyche has a natural tendency toward autonomy, and that to remain psychologically sovereign, one must protect the boundaries of the self. Overexposure dissolves those boundaries. You invite psychic contamination. Other people's energies enter your inner world, shaping how you see yourself. You lose psychological independence without even realizing it. Manipulation begins the moment someone realizes that your self-disclosure reveals what controls you. Tell them your fears, and they'll know where to press. Tell them your dreams, and they'll know what to promise. Tell them your insecurities, and they'll know what to withhold. Jung called this the complex-driven relationship, a dynamic in which people unconsciously exploit each other's psychological weak spots. The manipulator doesn't always act maliciously. Often they're possessed by their own unconscious needs. But the result is the same. You feel drained, confused, and less yourself after being with them. That's because you've allowed your psychic contents to become part of their psychic economy. The modern world encourages this vulnerability under the guise of authenticity. Share your truth, it says, speak your story. But Jung would warn that truth, when shared indiscriminately, loses its sacredness. What is sacred cannot be understood by every ear. To share it with those who are unprepared is to profane it, to turn meaning into gossip, to reduce symbol into noise. The unconscious resists such exposure. When you speak too openly about your inner world, you violate its privacy, and it retaliates through fatigue, disillusionment, or anxiety. You feel off not because of what you said, but because you have symbolically handed over power that was meant to stay within. This dynamic is visible everywhere, especially in relationships. People often mistake emotional transparency for trust. They think that revealing everything about themselves will create intimacy. But Jung understood that real intimacy is not built through exposure, it's built through resonance. Two psyches meet not in what they say, but in what they sense. Over-disclosure destroys that resonance because it floods the space with ego. It leaves no mystery for the unconscious to explore. The more you talk, the less magnetic you become. What should be sacred energy turns into data, and data can be used against you. Manipulators instinctively understand this. They don't need to force control, they simply wait for information. They listen carefully to your confessions, your honesty, your openness. They study your emotional patterns. Jung would call this shadow feeding, the process by which another person's shadow gains energy from your unconscious exposure. The manipulator doesn't just use what you say, they feed on the emotional charge behind it. They learn how to trigger you, when to flatter you, when to withdraw affection to create anxiety. Every disclosure gives them a new lever to pull. This is why silence is not coldness, it's strategy. Psychological containment protects your energy from becoming someone else's tool. When you resist the urge to explain yourself, you preserve mystery, and mystery equals power. Jung observed that the unconscious is drawn to what it cannot fully know. When you remain slightly enigmatic, people project their own material onto you, but you control that projection instead of being controlled by it. You become the mirror rather than the reflection. The person who speaks less often knows more because they are not lost in the exchange of illusions. Disclosure also binds you to the collective psyche. Every time you explain your experiences to others, you unconsciously seek their validation, their interpretation, their symbolic permission to exist. Jung called this identification with the collective a regression into dependency. The moment you tell your story, you allow the collective to shape its meaning. You become a character in other people's minds rather than the author of your own myth. The most dangerous consequence of this is spiritual disempowerment. Your life ceases to be your inner journey and becomes a social performance. People who manipulate others often operate through archetypal roles. They might play the savior who uses your confessions to feel powerful, the victim who turns your vulnerability into guilt, or the judge who uses your story to reinforce moral superiority. Jung would say these are not people acting consciously, but archetypes acting through them. When you disclose, you activate these archetypes in the listener. You awaken their inner complexes. Suddenly, your relationship becomes a stage where ancient dramas of power, shame, and redemption unfold. Most of it happens below awareness, but the emotional consequences are real. You feel pulled, obligated, trapped in invisible threads of expectation. To navigate this, one must develop psychological discretion, the ability to discern when and to whom to speak. Jung saw discretion not as repression, but as maturity. It's the ego's recognition of psychic law that energy must be directed consciously, not impulsively. When you feel the urge to get something off your chest, pause and ask, is this impulse coming from my ego or from myself? The ego wants to discharge tension through speech. The self prefers to transform tension through silence. Every time you choose silence, you strengthen the bridge between ego and self. Every time you choose impulsive disclosure, you weaken it. The manipulative power of disclosure is most evident in the way people weaponize empathy. They draw you in with their own confessions, making you feel safe to reciprocate. Once you open up, they subtly reposition themselves as authority figures over your inner life. They might offer advice, judgment, or pity, all of which place them above you energetically. Jung recognized this as the inflation of the helper archetype, the unconscious superiority that arises when one person feels responsible for another's soul. Genuine empathy doesn't demand exposure, it offers space. But false empathy thrives on your self-revelation because it feeds its own identity as the savior or healer. At the core of all manipulation lies projection. When you reveal yourself too quickly, others project their unconscious content onto your words. They stop seeing you as you are and begin seeing you as the symbol of their own unresolved material. You tell them about your pain and they interpret it through their guilt. You share your joy and they resent it through their envy. Your story becomes a screen for their complexes. Jung's great insight was that projection is inevitable, but awareness can control its direction. The person who remains silent allows others to project freely but remains unaffected, watching from the center. The person who discloses excessively gets lost in those projections, becoming whatever others need them to be. This is why silence is not only a defense but a diagnostic tool. When you say less, you see more. You begin to notice who tries to fill your silence with control, who grows uncomfortable when they cannot read you, who interprets your quiet as guilt or arrogance. Silence reveals character. Manipulative people fear what they cannot decode because it removes their leverage. Jung observed that the unconscious seeks predictability. It wants to categorize you into known archetypes. When you stop giving them material, you stop fitting into their narratives. You become psychologically untouchable. The ego, however, resists this approach. It wants to be understood even if it means being misused. It wants witnesses to its pain. This is the paradox. The same longing for recognition that drives oversharing also creates vulnerability to manipulation. The ego mistakes exposure for connection because it confuses being known with being loved. Jung saw this as a central tragedy of the human condition, the misdirection of spiritual yearning into social dependence. We seek communion through confession instead of through consciousness. We hand over our secrets hoping someone else will translate them, forgetting that only the self can interpret the language of the soul. In practical terms, this means that every act of disclosure should be treated as ritual. Before you speak, ask yourself 3 questions. Is this necessary? Is this sacred? Is this safe? If the answer to any is no, the silence will serve you better. Jung would approve of this restraint because it mirrors the discipline of the alchemist, who never opens the vessel before the reaction is complete. The alchemist knows that the material must endure pressure and heat before it can transmute into gold. Likewise, your inner experiences must mature in silence before being shared. If you expose them too early, they lose potency. What could have been gold becomes ash. Manipulation also thrives on the human discomfort with ambiguity. The more someone knows about you, the easier it is for them to define you, and definition is control. Jung warned against identifying with fixed roles because they limit psychic growth. When you constantly explain who you are, you build your own psychological prison. Others begin to expect consistency with the version of yourself you've narrated. You feel pressured to perform your own story. Silence, by contrast, keeps you fluid. It allows you to evolve without permission. The self is always transforming. Speech freezes it in time. There is a subtle form of manipulation that operates even without malice, emotional contagion. When you share your experiences with others, you invite their emotional field into yours. Their reactions, whether pity, shock, or admiration, enter your psyche and alter your energy. Jung described this as participation mystique, a merging of psychic fields reminiscent of primitive consciousness. In such states, boundaries blur. Your emotions stop belonging entirely to you. This is why after certain conversations you feel strangely drained or restless. You've absorbed another person's psychic residue. Silence is the only way to detox from this invisible exchange. It re-establishes psychic separation. True psychological freedom means owning your interior life completely. That ownership requires privacy. Privacy is not secrecy born of fear. It's sovereignty born of wisdom. The person who guards their inner world does not fear exposure. They simply understand its cost. Jung often emphasized that the self is sacred space. Not everyone should be allowed inside. To reveal yourself only to those who have earned the right through empathy and integrity is not pride. It's spiritual hygiene. Disclosure also has karmic consequences. Whatever you reveal becomes part of the collective psyche. Your words enter the symbolic bloodstream of the culture. If you speak from ego, you feed the collective shadow, fear, envy, resentment. If you speak from self, you transmit light, but the self speaks rarely and only when necessary. Most of what we call sharing is egoic noise that adds to collective confusion. Silence, therefore, is an act of purification. It keeps your contribution to the collective clean. It ensures that when you finally do speak, your words carry archetypal weight. They resonate not as opinion but as truth. The most powerful people in history understood this instinctively. Saints, sages, mystics, and leaders of depth all practiced measured speech. Jung admired figures like Meister Eckhart and Lao Tzu precisely because their wisdom emerged from silence. Their few words carried the force of entire philosophies because they were distilled through long periods of inward listening. In contrast, modern communication devalues silence. It rewards immediacy, reaction, and exposure. But the psyche cannot evolve in such noise. To develop depth, you must resist the collective tempo and return to the ancient rhythm of silence and speech, inhalation and exhalation, secrecy and revelation. When you master the art of withholding, you begin to recognize disclosure as a tool rather than a reflex. You speak deliberately, not impulsively. You share only what strengthens connection without diminishing your sovereignty. This balance mirrors Jung's principle of individuation, the integration of opposites. True individuation is neither isolation nor exposure. It's conscious engagement. You reveal without surrendering, connect without losing, speak without leaking. Every word becomes intentional, every silence purposeful. Manipulation loses its grip in the presence of such consciousness. The person who no longer needs to disclose for validation becomes ungovernable. Their energy is sealed, their emotions self-contained. They cannot be flattered into compliance or guilted into confession. They relate from choice, not compulsion. Jung might say that they've achieved psychological autonomy, the rare state in which the self directs the ego instead of being directed by it. Their silence no longer hides fear, it emanates authority. In essence, disclosure is power. Used wisely, it forges authentic bonds. Used carelessly, it becomes self-betrayal. Jung would remind us that every revelation should serve individuation, not fragmentation. When you speak from your center, your words liberate. When you speak from your wounds, your words enslave. The difference lies in awareness. To disclose consciously is to express truth. To disclose unconsciously is to leak energy. Silence is the bridge between the two, the pause where you decide whether the world deserves to hear what the soul has whispered. Part 6. Individuation, the sacred path of privacy. There comes a point in every human life when the noise of the world becomes unbearable, not because it is too loud, but because it is meaningless. The soul begins to crave depth over dialogue, essence, over expression. This is the moment when individuation calls the process by which a person becomes who they truly are, distinct from the masks of society, the roles of family, and the expectations of the collective. Jung called individuation the sacred duty of every soul, and privacy in its truest sense is its sanctuary. Individuation cannot happen in public view. It is a private revolution, a spiritual metamorphosis that unfolds in silence. Jung wrote that no one can make you whole except yourself. This wholeness requires withdrawal from the collective psyche, the endless chatter, comparison, and external validation that fragment the self. Privacy becomes the psychological womb where integration takes place. Without it, the ego remains trapped in performance, endlessly reacting to what others think. Privacy, therefore, is not withdrawal from life. It is the return to life's source. In Jungian terms, individuation is the alignment of the ego with the self, the divine center of the psyche that holds the blueprint of one's total being. To align with the self, one must first detach from external identifications. This detachment cannot occur while you are constantly explaining, sharing, or defending yourself. Every disclosure ties you to the collective field of perception. Every explanation feeds the persona, the social mask. The more you try to be understood, the less you hear the self. Privacy cuts that cord. It creates psychic distance from the collective, allowing your inner voice to re-emerge from beneath the noise of adaptation. Privacy is sacred because it protects the process of transformation from interference. When you are individuating, you are reshaping psychic structures that were formed by family, culture, and history. This is a fragile process, one that cannot withstand the invasive gaze of others. The moment you try to explain what is happening, you externalize it, and the transformation loses its autonomy. Jung compared individuation to alchemy. The psyche, like the alchemical vessel, must be sealed for the reaction to occur. To open it too soon is to destroy the work. Privacy is that seal. It is the invisible boundary that keeps the soul's chemistry intact. The modern world misunderstands privacy. It equates it with secrecy, with avoidance, even with selfishness. But in Jungian psychology, privacy is not withdrawal from love or connection. It is an act of love toward the self. It says, I am worth protecting. My becoming deserves space. The sacred path of privacy is not about hiding from others. It's about refusing to betray your own becoming for the sake of belonging. It's about stepping out of the marketplace of identity and entering the temple of silence where your true nature waits. In the absence of privacy, the psyche becomes performative. It shapes itself for an audience. The individual loses contact with their inner authority and becomes dependent on outer validation. Jung saw this as a kind of psychic exile, living outside one's own soul. The constant need to disclose, to share progress, to seek approval scatters the energy that should be guiding individuation. Privacy reverses this fragmentation. It recollects the psyche. It brings the scattered pieces of your being home. Privacy also transforms your relationship with time. When you live publicly, you live reactively. You rush to update, to respond, to narrate. In privacy, time slows down. The unconscious reveals itself gradually in symbols, dreams, and synchronicities. You begin to see that life itself is communicating with you. Jung called this the dialogue with the self. It's not spoken but sensed. It requires patience, and patience requires silence. The more private your process, the more profound your synchronicities become. The universe begins to mirror your inner state because you're no longer leaking psychic energy outward. This sacred privacy is not loneliness, it's solitude. Loneliness is the absence of others. Solitude is the presence of the self. Jung often distinguished between the two. He said that solitude is the furnace of transformation, the space where the ego encounters the unconscious and learns humility. Without solitude, the ego remains inflated, convinced it is the master of life. But in privacy, the ego meets its limits. It realizes that it is a fragment of something vaster, something eternal. This realization is the birth of spiritual consciousness. Every stage of individuation demands privacy. When you first confront the shadow, you need privacy to face what is dark and unflattering without the interference of judgment. When you encounter the anima or animus, the inner contrasexual archetype, you need privacy to explore emotional depths that cannot be rationalized to others. When you approach the self, you need privacy to endure the awe and fear of the numinous without dilution. Privacy is not isolation from life, but insulation for the sacred fire of transformation. The path of individuation always involves what Jung called the withdrawal of projections. This means recognizing that the qualities you see in others, whether love, hatred, envy, or admiration, are mirrors of your own unconscious. But you cannot see this truth if you're always entangled in relationships, social dynamics, or endless explanations. Privacy allows you to withdraw these projections consciously. When you stop speaking about others and begin observing your reactions in silence, you start seeing which parts of yourself you've disowned. That insight marks the beginning of freedom. To the uninitiated, privacy looks like detachment. To the awakened, it feels like sovereignty. When you no longer need to tell everyone what you're doing, you realize how much of your energy was wasted trying to be understood. Jung believed that most suffering arises from the ego's resistance to solitude. The ego wants witnesses. The soul wants quiet. When you finally give the soul what it wants, peace arrives. Not the peace of having everything resolved, but the peace of being aligned with your inner rhythm. Privacy also guards against inflation, the false sense of spiritual superiority that can arise during individuation. When you start to awaken, it's tempting to announce your insights, to declare your new awareness to others. But Jung warned that premature expression of spiritual experiences leads to inflation. The ego hijacks the sacred. It says, "Look how evolved I am." Privacy humbles that impulse. It teaches reverence. It reminds you that the sacred cannot be displayed, it must be lived. True wisdom hides itself until the ego is mature enough to carry it without pride. There is a paradox in individuation. It leads you toward unity with all humanity, yet it requires profound aloneness. Jung understood this as the tension between opposites that drives psychic growth. To individuate, you must temporarily separate from the collective, so you can return to it as a whole being. Privacy makes this oscillation possible. It's the rhythm of the self-contraction and expansion, retreat and return. Without the contraction of privacy, your expansion into the world becomes superficial. Without returning to the world, privacy becomes sterile. The sacred path lies in balance, to be alone without isolation, to be connected without exposure. From a symbolic perspective, privacy corresponds to the archetype of the sanctum, the inner temple of the soul. In every religion, there is a sacred space where only the initiate may enter. Jung believed this archetype lives within the human psyche. It represents the inviolable center of individuality. In dreams, it often appears as a hidden room, a secret garden, or a locked chest. The message is always the same: not everything about you is meant for the world. Some parts must remain sealed, known only to you and the self. That secrecy is not concealment, it's consecration. As you move deeper into individuation, you begin to see how much of life is a distraction from being. Conversations, relationships, even ambitions, all of them can become ways to avoid the confrontation with the self. Jung said that the self is both terrifying and magnetic. To meet it is to meet God within, but the divine demands solitude. Privacy becomes the temple where that encounter occurs. You cannot bring witnesses into it. The presence of others disturbs the silence where eternity speaks. There's an alchemical image that captures this truth perfectly: the hermaphrodite in the vessel, a symbol of union between opposites, the masculine and feminine, the conscious and unconscious. This union occurs only within the sealed container. The vessel is privacy itself. It protects the sacred marriage from contamination by the outer world. When you live too publicly, your inner masculine and feminine energies scatter. You lose integration. Privacy allows them to dance without interruption until they merge into wholeness. The result is androgynous consciousness, balanced, creative, complete. Privacy also sharpens moral integrity. When no one is watching, you encounter your real self. The public self acts according to norms. The private self reveals truth. Jung believed that the test of individuation is not how you behave under observation, but how you live in solitude. Do you keep promises to yourself? Do you tell the truth when silence would be easier? Do you treat your own mind with respect? Privacy exposes your relationship with conscience. It shows whether your values are authentic or borrowed. This is why many resist solitude. It forces moral clarity. In the age of oversharing, privacy has become a radical act. It defies the collective compulsion to expose, perform, and compete. To keep your life private today is to declare independence from the collective unconscious. Jung would call this the emergence of ego, self-alignment when your actions are guided by inner authority rather than external influence. The individuated person does not need approval to validate their path. They consult the self, not the audience. Their life becomes a dialogue between consciousness and eternity, not between ego and applause. Privacy also transforms creativity. Jung saw creativity as a byproduct of individuation, the psyche's natural expression of integration. But creativity requires incubation. Ideas are fragile when first born. If you share them too early, they become intellectual before they become real. Privacy gives them room to breathe, to take form in the unconscious. Artists, inventors, and mystics instinctively know this. Their greatest work is done in solitude. They return to the world not to seek validation, but to reveal what has matured in silence. Privacy thus becomes the midwife of creation. One of Jung's most profound insights was that individuation is not selfish, it's service. The more you become yourself, the more you contribute to collective healing. But this contribution can only come from wholeness, and wholeness requires privacy. The person who has not known solitude cannot offer authenticity. They can only offer reflections of collective values. The individuated person, by contrast, carries something original, a light that does not flicker in the winds of opinion. They speak rarely, but when they do, their words have weight because they arise from the self. To walk the sacred path of privacy is to live symbolically. You begin to see life as an unfolding myth in which every event, person, and emotion plays a role in your individuation. You no longer need to broadcast your journey because you recognize it as holy. The details belong to the gods, not the crowd. Jung said that those who understand their life symbolically are no longer victims of circumstance. They see meaning where others see chaos. Privacy sustains that symbolic awareness by keeping the profane world at bay. It preserves the sanctity of your myth. The danger of a public life is dissipation. The gift of a private one is condensation. The alchemists knew this heat and pressure create transformation, not exposure. Privacy is psychic heat, it intensifies experience. The feelings you would normally diffuse through speech now ferment into insight. Pain becomes wisdom, desire becomes creativity, loneliness becomes revelation. This is the magic of containment. Jung understood that the psyche transforms energy, not events. The more contained your energy, the deeper your transformation. In silence, you start to feel the subtle rhythm of your destiny. Jung believed that each soul has an innate pattern, a transcendent function, guiding it toward wholeness. This pattern reveals itself not through noise, but through intuition, coincidence, and inner knowing. Privacy attunes you to that frequency. When you stop narrating your life, you start living in synchrony with it. You move from self-disclosure to self-revelation. What needs to be known reveals itself without words. At the heart of individuation lies the paradox of disappearance. As you become more yourself, you become less visible to the world. You withdraw from superficial circles, meaningless chatter, and compulsive sharing. To others, it looks like retreat. In truth, it's ascension into authenticity. You have become private not because you are hiding, but because you no longer need witnesses to confirm your reality. You exist from within. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and becoming requires silence." The sacred path of privacy ultimately returns you to simplicity. You stop performing complexity for others and start embodying clarity for yourself. You realize that nothing essential needs to be explained. The self speaks in silence, and that silence radiates peace. The individuated person does not chase influence, they emanate it. They do not argue truth, they embody it. Their privacy becomes their sanctuary, their presence, their message. In a world addicted to noise, such stillness is revolutionary. Individuation, then, is not a journey outward, but inward through the chambers of privacy where the divine and the human meet. It's not about becoming extraordinary, but about becoming whole. And privacy, the sacred guardrail of the soul, ensures that this becoming remains pure, untouched, and eternal. Silence is not emptiness, it's the place where God whispers. The moment you stop talking about your life, you begin to hear the life within you. Jung believed that the self does not shout, it reveals itself only in stillness. Protect your energy, honor your privacy, and let your silence become your sanctuary. The less they know, the more you grow.